Hi, I'm Rowan Miller. Let's write an application that uses Entity Framework Database First to access data in an existing relational database. In this workflow, we use the Entity Framework Designer to reverse engineer a model based on that database. In this video, I'm going to use Visual Studio 2012, but you can also use Visual Studio 2010. Before we create our application, let's look at the database we'll be targeting. Visual Studio 2012 comes with LocalDB by default, and I've created a database first.blogging database on my LocalDB instance. The database contains the familiar blog and posts model, where a blog has many posts and a post belongs to a blog. Now that you've seen the database, let's create the application. I'm going to create a console application and call it Database First Sample. Now that we've got an application, it's time to add the Entity Framework model. To do this, I right-click on my project and select Add New Item. Then I select Data and the ADO.NET Entity Data Model. I'm going to call this one Blogging Model. We're going to reverse engineer from an existing database, so I'm going to select that and then click Next. Then I'm going to enter the connection information for the Database First.blogging database on my LocalDB instance. I'm also going to change the name of the connection string that's stored in my configuration file to be blogging context. This also happens to be the name that's used for the derived context, and you'll see where this happens later in this demo. As the final step of the wizard, I get to choose the objects from the database that I want included in the model. My database just contains two tables, so I'm going to tick the box next to Tables. If I expand this out, you'll see that it's going to import the Blog and Posts table. When I click Finish, Entity Framework is going to look at the shape of the tables in my database and reverse engineer a model to map to them. Once it's done that, the model is loaded up in the Entity Framework Designer and displayed for me to view and edit. I don't need to make any changes to the model, so it's time to start writing our application. Before we start writing the application, let's take a look at the classes we're going to interact with. If I look under the EDMX file in the Solution Explorer, I'll see that there are a couple of TT files there. These TT files are responsible for code generation. Note that if you're using Visual Studio 2010, these TT files won't be added to your project. Instead, you'll have code generated that uses Entity Framework 4. To upgrade to the latest version of Entity Framework, you'll need to follow some extra steps that are covered in the walkthrough that accompanies this video. One of these TT files is responsible for generating the derived context. This context represents a session with the database and allows us to query and save data. Looking at the context, I can see there's a couple of DB-set properties. These properties allow us to query and save instances of the types in our model. The second TT file is responsible for generating the types that make up our model. In our case, that's a blog and a post class. Looking at the blog class, I can see there's a couple of different types of properties in here. Scalar properties such as blog ID, name, and URL, and then navigation properties that make up the relationships between the types in my model, such as the posts property shown here. Now let's use these classes to perform data access. I'm going to go to the main method in the program file. The first thing I'm going to do is new up an instance of the blogging context. Note that when we use a context, we always wrap it in a using statement to ensure that any resources are freed up when we're finished. Next, I'm going to prompt the user for a name for a new blog. Then I'm going to create a new instance of the blog class with this name assigned. I'm then going to add it to the blogs property on our context. Remember that that's a DB set of blog. Once I've created the new instance and added it to the blogs property, I can then call save changes, which will push any pending changes in the context out to the database. In this case, that's a single insert for the blog we just created. I'm also going to write a link query that queries for all blogs from the database ordered by name. I can then for each over the results of this query and write the names out to the console. Now that we've written our application, let's go ahead and run it and see what happens. As expected, we're prompted for the name for a new blog. I'm going to use ADO.NET blog as the name. A list of all blogs in the database is then printed out to the console. This includes a new blog that we just inserted. Now that we've created a basic model, let's see what happens when some changes are made to the database and we need to update our model to reflect these. I'm going to open up a new query for our database first.blogging database and paste in some SQL that will create a new users table. I'm going to run this SQL, and then if I refresh the tables in the database, I'll see that the users table is now present. To bring this table into our model, I'm going to open up our model again in the Entity Framework Designer. I'm then going to right-click on the design surface and select Update Model from Database. The Update Model wizard has a number of tabs to identify which items are going to be added, refreshed, and deleted from the model. I can see that the Users table is listed on the Add tab, and I'm going to check the box to make sure this gets added to the model. The Refresh and Delete tabs are read-only, and they're just informing you what Entity Framework is going to do based on the changes it found in the model. When I click Finish, I can see that the Users entity is now added to my model. In this video, we saw how to reverse engineer a model from an existing database using the Entity Framework Designer. We then saw how to perform data access using this model. Finally, we saw how to update the model when changes are applied to the database.